So I welcome you all to the third session of today's lecture series. I welcome Professor Madhumita Chattopadhyay to this a week-long course on Indian philosophy organized by the Bhaktivedanta Research Center. Today, Professor Chattopadhyay
Excuse me, there is no sound, madam.
You cannot hear me?
Oh,
Hello?
yes, now I can. Now I can.
Okay, I welcome Professor Chattopadhyay to this week-long course on Western philosophy on behalf of the Bhaktivedanta Research Center. We are indeed grateful that Professor Chattopadhyay will be speaking on Buddhist Refutation of Universals. Professor Chattopadhyay teaches philosophy in Jadavpur University. She is also the coordinator of the Center for Buddhist Studies in the same university. She was also the officiating dean of the Faculty of Arts of Jadavpur University. She has been really a prolific writer, and her expertise ranges from Western logic to Indian philosophy. Her areas of specialization is now currently more on Buddhist philosophy with special emphasis on Buddhist epistemology, logic, and semantics. But we also consider her to be a philosophy of logic person because her first work was on paradoxes. She has authored 4 books on Buddhism and contributed articles in peer-reviewed national and international journals. Of the different books written by her, I'm mentioning just a few. Walking Along the Paths of Buddhist Epistemology, Ratnakirti on Apoha, Nagarjuner, Darshana Parikrama, Tarko Bhasha, O Mokkho of Mokkho Karogupto. She has been awarded Bukku Denno Kyokai Fellowship in 2002 in Japan, Fulbright Fellowship in 2004, Indo-Hungarian Exchange Program in 2007, Charles Wallace India Trust Fellowship in 2008, JSPS Fellowship in 2010. She was a fellow of Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla, and she has been awarded, I'm sorry, I'm mispronouncing all these things, Khyentse Visiting Professorship at Savitribhai Phule Pune University in 2023. Without much ado, I request Professor Chattopadhyay to commence her lecture. Madhumita ji.
Thank you, Madhuchanda, for your. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for your nice introduction. I don't know whether I am so great as you mentioned, but I always consider myself to be a student of Buddhist philosophy, trying to explore for myself the different aspects of Buddhism. Like, especially as you mentioned, my area of research is in respect of Buddhist Buddhist logic, epistemology, and as logic epistemology is closely related to metaphysics and ontology. Therefore, while studying the logic and epistemology, I have to consider their metaphysics, and I have to study their metaphysics and ontology. Today, I will be talking on one of the issues, one of the concepts which is very, very important in Buddhist philosophy and which is important not only in the realm of metaphysics and ontology, but for understanding their semantics, their theory of meaning. That is, their interpretation of universals. So I have given as the title of my talk, Buddhist Refutation of Universals. Now, in the introduction, I have just pointed out what are why it is necessary to deal with this topic. What does it deal with? What is its main concern? One of the most important concepts or notions which have drawn the interest of the thinkers, both Indian and Western, is that of universal. Universal is admitted to account for the communality of a group of individuals and also to account for the meaning of general terms like cow, man, etc. Regarding the ontological status of such universals, a controversy is noticed among the idealists and the realist schools. In Indian philosophy, the Nayavaisheshika thinkers are considered to be representatives of realism and the Buddhists as advocates of idealism. It is no doubt true that or not all the Buddhists are idealists. We can find realism also among realists among the Buddhists. That's why the question would arise if universals are admitted by the Nuyayikas, by the Nayavaisheshika schools as real, since the Nayavaisheshika schools are realists, those schools of Buddhism who are supporters of realism, can they admit the existence of universal? The answer is no. All the schools of Buddhism, irrespective of whether they believe in the existence of external objects or not, they are unanimous. All the schools of Buddhism are unanimous in denying the existence of universals over and above the individuals. Now, let us first note what is a universal. A universal, according to the Nayavaisheshika school, is a category which is inherent in many individuals, which is visible or perceptible, which is one, single, and permanent. We all know this definition of universal or samanya from our school days, from our early college days. That is, nityatte sati aneko samavetatam. The Nayavaisheshika thinkers hold that such universal can be apprehended by perception. For example, the knowledge that this is a cow is possible by Sangyukta Samavaya Sannikorsha. By analyzing this above definition, namely nityatte sati aneko samavetatam, we can find that according to the Nuyayikas, a universal has certain features. Number one, it is one. Number two, it is eternal. Number three, it is existent in many individuals. And number four, the relation between the individual and the universal is one of inherence or samavaya. Every existent entity, with the exception of the extreme universal, technically called parasamanya, and the extreme individual, antya vishesha, possesses both generality, samanya, and individuality, bhakti. In perceiving a thing, one perceives it at the first moment vaguely, without differentiating the individuality and the generality. That is, in the first moment, when we perceive a thing, we perceive it as something. But later on, in the second moment, when we analyze what is the object, then we can say that this is so and so. Like, this is a jar, this is a flower vase, this is a table, etc. And when we do so, we actually are apprehending the object, that is the object. And it is in that object, in that apprehension, we can determine clearly that there is a combination of individuality and generality. Individuality is this, and the generality is the notion of cowness, or the notion of tableness, the notion of being a flower vase, the notion of being a jar, etc. Hence, for the Nuyaikas, both the individual, which in their language is the Vishesha, the particular, as well as the universals are real. Why they are real? Because they are perceptible. Of course, the way we perceive the individuality is different from the way in which we perceive the generality. In the case of the individuality, we perceive it by the relation. We perceive the relation, conjunction, which is called sangyoga. That is, the eye or the sense organ has contact with the object. And since in that object there resides the generality as its property, so when we perceive the object, we also perceive its quality, which is here the generality. So the generality is also apprehended by myself, that is, by my eyes. And since the generality exists in the individual by the relation of inherence or samobhaya, so the relation between my sense organ and the universal or the generality will be that of Sangyukta Samobhaya. So whatever be the nature of the relationship between the sense organ and the individuality and generality, it is the fact that it is the fact that my sense organ grasps both the individuality and the generality. Since the perception is a source of knowledge, therefore we have to admit the existence of both the individual as well as the universal or the general. Now, this view of the Nuyaikas, Nyaya school, which also seems to be supported by our ordinary thinking or common sense, is criticized by the Buddhists. Before going into the criticism of the Buddhists, before passing on to that portion, let us first see what the Buddhist view is about this universal. As opposed to the Nuyaikas, the Buddhists hold a different interpretation. That is, they do not accept this view of the Nyaya school. Why? Because the Buddhists are believers in the doctrine of change. So for them, everything in the world is momentary. And as they are believers in the momentary character of everything, changing, because in the if I say momentary, then it will refer to the views of the later Buddhists. So in order to cover the, because in the earlier phase, the term momentary was not popular. There they used to speak about, that is, in the Buddha Vachana, we have the expression anicca. That is, anicca means that is impermanent, changing. So this, since the Buddhists believe in the doctrine of change, momentary character of all entities, they cannot admit anything as eternal. But as you have noticed that the one of the essential features of of universal, according to the Neo school, is that it must be eternal. Universal is eternal. And since for the Buddhists, nothing, everything is changing, everything is momentary, therefore they cannot accept anything which is eternal. This is the basic reason why they are challenging the Nuyayicas regarding the existence of the universals. The Buddhists admit the reality of individuals only, which in their terminology are regarded as salokshanas. Universals, in their terminology samana lakshana, are conceptually constructed by the mind through generalization from many individuals without any regard for their individuality. Since they are conceptually constructed, they are constructed by our human mind, these universals or the general feature generality, they are devoid of reality. The Buddhists hold that universals are non-existent, or even if it existent, at least it is unknowable. This is another important view of the Buddhists. That is, we cannot know the universals. While the Nuyayicas believe that we can know the universal just as we can know the individuals, the Buddhists hold that we can know the individuals, the salokshanas, but we can never know the samana lakshanas. The samana lakshanas are our mental constructions. Accordingly, they criticize and refute the notion of universal as has been admitted by the realist school, especially the Neo and the Boisheshikos. Let us now see the arguments which are offered by the Buddhists for refuting the universals. The first argument is that in the very first argument, they are trying to show that the notion of universal, as has been defined by the Nuyayicas, cannot be accepted. Why? Because for the Nuyayicas, the universal is one, is eternal. Number two is it is one or single. And number three is it is existent in many. It is existent in many by the relation of inherence. Okay. Now, the Buddhists point out that the second two features, namely being one and being one, indivisible, single, and the other feature, namely residing in a plurality of instances, cannot be admitted. These two properties cannot go hand in hand. To explain, if the universal is to reside in any individual, it can do it either completely or partially. That is, either the entire universal exists in the individual, or only one part of that universal exists or resides in the individual. Now let us take the first alternative. That is, the one universal, suppose it is you, it resides in the given individual one, in its entirety. Now, since the universal exists, universal, first it is said universal is one. So you have said universal is one. Now, if we say that the universal U is residing in individual one, in its totality, in its entirety, then the very moment it exists in individual one, it cannot exist in individual two, individual three, because the entire universal is present in the individual one at that moment. In that case, those individuals, I2, individual 2, individual 3, etc., will have to be regarded as as being without universal. Hence, the universal cannot be regarded to reside in a plurality of instances. The other part, that is, we have said that if we accept the definition of universal as given by the Noyaikos, we have to say that the universal is one single entity, and it resides in many individuals at one and the same time. We have found now, for the question we have raised is, if the universal is to reside in any is to exist in any individual, it can do so either completely, totally, or partially. Now, if we have already seen what is the problem if the universal resides in the individuals totally, what will happen? What will happen? There we have found that if the universal resides in any of the individual completely, totally, at a moment, then in that moment, other individuals will have to be said to lack that universal. So we cannot say that the universal is one and it is resident in many at the same time. We cannot say so. So this is one problem. And the other half says that the universal, this problem might be solved by thinking that the universal resides in the individuals only partially, not totally. Let us see whether this alternative fares better. If, on the other hand, the universal is conceived as residing only partially in each of its individual instances, then it loses its indivisibility character, or its oneness feature, as it will be said to have as many internal divisions as there are individuals in which the universal is supposed to reside. Okay, so if there are 10 individuals and the universal U is said to exist in all the 10 individuals partially, then it means that universal U consists of 10 parts, of which the first part will be existent in individual 1, the second part will be existent in individual 2, and in this way all the 10 individuals will have 10 different parts of one and the same universal U. But you have said that the universal U is one single. So if you admit that it is one single entity, then at the same time you cannot admit that the universal exists in many individuals. So the first argument, standard argument of the Buddhists is that the Naiyayikas cannot claim that the universal is one and it resides in many at the same time. Okay, so this narrow view cannot be accepted. Am I clear to everybody?
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
If you have any question, then please ask, or you can ask at the end. Okay.
Okay, ma'am. Okay, ma'am.
Or you can just stop me and ask me the question also. No problem.
Okay, okay.
I think up to this is clear. It is clear.
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
The second argument of the Buddhists is that universals are unknowable. Yeah. You have noted that in the when we presented the narrow view, we did mention that the universals can be known by perception. Okay, I mentioned that because since universal resides in the individual by the relation of inherence, when my sense organ comes in contact with the individual object, comes in contact with the individual object, and since in that individual object there resides the universal, therefore my visual organ, when it apprehends the individual object, can also apprehend the universal at the same time. The only difference is that in the case of the individual object, the relation is Sangyogo, and while in the case of universal, it is Sangyukta Samobhaya. Whatever be the relationship, the universal is known by perception in the same fashion as the individual is known. So, according to the Nyaya school, the universal or samana is apprehended by perception. Okay, so it is known. Now, this notion of universal as something which is perceptible has been challenged by the Buddhists. They say that the concept of universal appears to be that of an organizing principle by virtue of which a plurality of individuals can be collected together in a class. Okay, that is, why do we need a universal? We need a universal to collect the different individuals, different individuals into a class. So, universal thus seems to be a unifying principle, a unifying principle, which can, which helps to collect the different individuals. That is, which helps to collect the individuals who are by themselves different from each other into one group. Okay. Now, the Buddhists point out that if we admit this role of the universal, that is, if we say that universal is such a principle which can bind the different individuals to form a class, then that universal can never be known. Okay, knowing that means knowing that universal, which is the binding principle to collect all the individuals to one class or group. That kind of principle, as a principle of that kind, universal is not possible. For in order to know the universal, knowledge of each individual in that class determined by the universal is required. What do I mean by this, or what do the Buddhists mean by this? They try to say that when we speak of the universal manhood, the universal manhood, we say that the universal manhood belongs to all the individual human beings who are actually different from each other. But because of that principle, of having humanity in them, all the individuals are grouped together and called human beings. Okay. Now, when we say that this is the class of men, this is the class of cows, this is the class of birds, we need to know all the individuals who belong to that class so that we can say that there is one unifying principle which can bind the members, bind the different members and form this class. Now, for this, what is required is not only the knowledge of the individuals present before us at this moment, but also we have to have knowledge of individuals who existed in the past and who will come to exist in the future, as also the individuals who are existing in other parts of the universe at this present moment. But to know all these past, present, and future individuals is physically impossible for any finite being. Hence, it would be impossible to know a universal. This is the view of the Buddhists. Now, when the Buddhists are refuting or criticizing the Buddhists, when the Buddhists are refuting or criticizing the Nyayo, will the Nyayo sit simply mum and accept what they are saying? No, obviously not. Then they try to offer a different argument in support of their own view, so that the Buddhists have to admit that there are universals. That is, the Nyayo view stands. Now, what is this new argument, or what is this new argument of the Nyayo in support of the universal? The Nuyaikos try to say that in order to establish the existence of a class, jati, or a samana, the argument that the Nyayo school offers proceeds like this. Premise number one, a qualified cognition, Vishishta Buddhi. Vishishta Buddhi has an invariable connection with the knowledge of the qualifier, Visheshano Jnana. That is, Vishishta Buddhi always involves knowledge of the Visheshana. For example, to regard someone as a dandi, one requires to have the knowledge of a danda. So it says the knowledge of a stick holder follows the knowledge of the stick, which is actually its qualifier. Because someone is regarded to be a dandi only when he holds the stick. So this example shows that in every case, when we are having a qualified cognition, then prior to that qualified cognition, we must have the knowledge of the qualifier. Now, this is the general proposition. This is the general proposition. The second premise says the knowledge, this is a cow, is a qualified cognition. This is ghotoyam, this or go-oyam, this is a qualified cognition or Vishishta Buddhi. Therefore, according to the first principle, this cognition, ghotoyam, must be preceded by the knowledge of the universal jarness, ghotottva. So this must be invariably connected with the qualifier cowness, gotta, which is actually a universal. So it is a fact that we have a Vishishta Buddhi, and to have a Vishishta Buddhi, we require a knowledge of the samana, or like ghototto, gotto, etc. And we can have knowledge of something only when that is existent. Therefore, we have to admit the knowledge of universal, like cowness, jarness, etc. So this is the argument of the Nyayo. This inference is actually grounded, as I have earlier said, this argument is based on the first principle, that is the which is actually a principle of causality that holds between the qualified cognition, Vishishta Buddhi, and the knowledge of the qualifier Visheshano Jnana, Visheshano Buddhi. And this qualified cognition is the effect of what? Effect of the Visheshano Buddhi. Now, since we are having a Vishishta Buddhi, so from the Vishishta Buddhi, we can infer the existence of the Visheshana. So the Nuyayiko says that the Nuyayiko asks the Buddhist that in your logical framework, logico-epistemological framework, you have accepted effect-cause relationship, karya-karana sambandha, for establishing the invariable relationship between the hetu and the sadhya. Here, in the present case, which is actually a Vishishta Jnana, Vishishta Buddhi, there should be also this kind of causal relationship. The hetu here is Vishishta Buddhi, and the probandam, the sadhu, here is the Visheshana Buddhi. So when the Vishishta Buddhi occurs, it must be preceded by its cause, which is the Visheshana Buddhi. So we have to admit the existence of the universal. Thus we find that the Nuyaikos are pointing to the principle of causality in order to establish the existence of the universal. Is this argument clear?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Now let us see what the Buddhist reaction would be. The Buddhist logicians criticize this argument on the ground that it is not clear as to what is the actual probandum here. There may be two alternatives. It is an invariable connection of the qualified knowledge with the knowledge of a separate qualifier. That is, there is an invariable connection between the qualified knowledge, qualified cognition, Vishishta Buddhi, and Bhinno Visheshana, and a separate qualifier, Bhinno Visheshana. There is an invariable connection between these two. Or it can be, the probandum can be, it is an invariable connection of the qualified cognition with the perception of qualifier in general. Visheshano matrasya anubandha. So earlier it was Vinno Visheshano, and here it is Visheshano matrasya anubhava. If the first alternative is accepted, it is contradicted by perception, because in indeterminate perception, neither the qualified object nor the qualifier is distinctly manifested. Hence, this kind of that is the distinction between the individual and its qualification and its qualifier is not apprehended by perception. no, what do I mean to say by this? Actually, the difference, the Buddhists are relying on their own on their own definition of perception. You all know that for the Neo-Vaisheshika school, the definition of perception is such that it can uh, uh, it can represent both determinate perception as well as indeterminate perception. In indeterminate perception, we apprehend or we perceive the object as a whole without making any distinction between the object and its qualifiers. But in determinate cognition, when we have knowledge like this is so and so, we have a relation between an entity as well as some qualifiers. Okay. So that is for the Neo school, both nirvikalpa perception and savikalpa perception, they are both pramana. But for the Buddhists in their epistemology, they have admitted perception, no doubt. Because they believe that there are two pramanas. One is perception and the other is inference, but their view of perception is something different, because according to them, perception is indeterminate. That is, in our perception, we perceive only the unique particular, we perceive only the individuality, and we do not perceive the relation between the entity and its qualifier. Okay. So, in the first alternative, when you say that the probandum is an invariable connection of the qualified knowledge with the knowledge of a separate qualifier, this is not possible, because perception never gives us knowledge of of an individual as qualified by a qualifier. It only grasps the object as a whole. That is, as this or that. Only it can be like that, because you all know that for the Buddhists, pratyaksha is kalpana purha. That is, it is free from all kinds of conceptual construction. Now, if Vishishta Buddhi, that is qualified cognition, is taken as the probans of the existence of the universal, the fallacy of inconclusiveness, anuikantika dosha, will occur, because qualified knowledge may be present without the presence of universal, as is the case like this is like this. When we say this is a jar, this is a jar, then this is not regarded as a qualified cognition. But here we find that this is associated. When we say jar, just jar, this is the jar, we apprehend the object, but we do not say that here it is, there are two parts. One is the individual, and the other is that which has the universal as its qualifier. So this Vishishta Buddhi. This will apply to this kind of knowledge also. The third argument of criticism. Just a minute. The Buddhists offered another argument to refute the universe. When a thing that is by nature perceptible is not perceived at a given time and place, we should admit that the thing is non-existent there at that time. For example, horns are by nature perceptible, but it is not perceived on the head of a horse. So it is not, we regard the horn to be non-existent there. Actually, here I am, the Buddhists are just referring to the conditions of Svabhavanupalabdhi. Okay, Svabhavanupalabdhi. You know that for the Buddhists, Anupalabdhi is a probans, is a hetu. Now, this hetu, this Anupalabdhi hetu is used for which purpose? To establish the non-existence of an entity. Okay. Now, they are trying to show, the Buddhists are trying to show that in the case of universal, this the conditions of Anupalabdhi are applicable. And Anupalabdhi establishes the non-existence of something. Therefore, by this Anupalabdhi, we can say that universals do not exist. Universals are non-existent. Let us go through the argument once again. When a thing that is by nature perceptible, okay, just for example, if I look at my table, study table, I find that there are lots of books, pens, etc. But I do not see any flower vase on it. Since there is no flower vase on the table, and since I do not perceive any flower vase on the table, but I perceive all other objects, and I know very well that flower vase is a big thing, and I can, if it were there, I could have seen it. But since I am not perceiving the flower vase, I can say that the flower vase is non-existent. The flower vase is absent in the table. Now, in the case of universal, what is happening? Universal is, according to the Neo school, perceptible. That is, we can perceive the universes, just as we can perceive the individuals. Now, it is a fact that we can perceive the individuals, but we cannot perceive the universal. Universal is by nature perceptible, but while perceiving the individual, we cannot perceive the universal. Therefore, we cannot admit that universal exists. This formulation of syllogism is based upon the non-apprehension of an entity itself. Thus, the Neo concept of universal as something eternal, one, and inherent in different individuals, which can be known by perception, cannot be accepted. one might argue that the non-perception of an object does not always guarantee its non-existence. As for example, in the case of knowledge, knowledge cannot be perceived. But from that non-perception, can we say that there is no knowledge? We cannot perceive knowledge anywhere in the universe. So, can we say that knowledge is absent? The Buddhists hold that it is not reasonable to opine that though universal is not visible, it can be accepted in a similar manner as that of knowledge. Though knowledge is not grasped by visual perception or by other sensory perceptions, it is established by self-consciousness, swa-sangvedana. Okay, so though I am not perceiving knowledge in a particular place, I can know it by another means, that is another variety of knowledge, that is called another variety of perception, that is called swa-sangvedana. However, the case of universal is different from that of knowledge, because according to the opponents, it is a quality of an object apprehensible by the senses. Hence, universal requires to be grasped by visual perception. So we cannot compare this universal with knowledge. Knowledge can be apprehended through swa-sangvedana, but universal samano, according to the Naiyayikas, can be apprehended only through the senses. Okay, so there is a difference between knowledge and universal. The Nyaya counter argument. The Naiyayikas point out that if the Buddhist logicians do not admit universals, they cannot account for inference as a source of knowledge. This is because knowledge of universal concomitance or Vyapti relation is the most vital procedure in the construction of an inference. In the standard example of Vyapti, namely when we infer fire from the observation of smoke, we require the Vyapti, namely where there is smoke, there is fire. Jatra dhuma, tatra boni. And this universal concomitant relation is not grasped between one particular smoke and one particular fire, but it involves class concepts like smokeness and fireness. The Buddhist logicians admit the existence of discrete and distinct particulars, that is the solokshanas only. They are determined in specific space, time, and form. Hence, Vyapti Groho cannot be generated between the class of Provence and the class of Probandum, like Dharma Samanyo and like Dhumo Samanyo and Bondhi Samanyo. Is this argument clear?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
So there might be a possible chance that a deviation can, that is, since you are not dealing with the universal smoke and universal fire. Huh? You are dealing with only one individual case of smoke and fire. So there is a chance of deviation. That is, there is a chance that in one case, it might so happen that the probans is present, but the probandum is absent. Hence, there is a chance of the fallacy of anoikantika. The Noyaikos do not have any logical difficulty in explaining the Vyapti relation, since they admit the Samanna Lakshana Sonikorsha in their theory of perception. And with the help of this Samanna Lakshana Sonikorsha, when they perceive one particular case of smoke as related with fire, then they can have the knowledge of the universal invariable relationship between all cases of smoke and all cases of fire. So, admission of universal according to the Nyaya school is necessary not only for ontological discussions, but it is essential for logico-epistemological discussions as well. So the Buddhists, now what is the upshot of this argument of the Noyaikos? This argument tries to point out that since in the Buddhist view, we cannot give a proper explanation of the Vyaptik Droho, we cannot accept, they cannot accept inference as a source of knowledge. And in all their arguments, the Buddhists have applied inference to refute the Noyayikas. Now, if inference itself cannot be accepted in their system, then how can the Nyaya view be rejected? So this is this is actually the spirit of this argument. Now, what would be the Buddhist response? That is, in rejecting the notion of universal, that is, the notion of the realist conception of universal, the question arises as to how the Buddhists can explain the commonality. The Buddhists also try to provide a deeper analysis of the notion of commonness. According to them, this notion is caused not only by any positive commonness residing in all the individual objects of a class, but by a negative commonness which belongs to all the individual objects. For instance, all the cows of the world are different from each other and have nothing in common except the performance of a particular function and the fact of their birth from similar causes. Yet all of them have a negative commonness, namely, they are all different from non-cows. For example, the horses, the dogs, etc. The universal cowness thus is only a negation in the form of exclusion of non-cows. It is called patad vyapritti, or exclusion of what a thing is not. The technical term used for it is Apoha, which is the Buddhist counterpart of the universal of the realist school. Now, what is Apoha? Regarding the nature of this Apoha, there can be three different interpretations, or there are three different interpretations available. Apoha may refer to an external object, such as a jar that is conceptually constructed, jatha odhyabashayam, that is, which is conceptually constructed. Number two, Apoha may be defined as a mental image, buddhakaro, as it reveals itself. Buddhakaro jatha pratibhasam. Apoha may be understood as the negation of a proposition that may actually signify the mere absence. Here, without stating the affirmation of the opposite, Apoha is understood as negating, as negation, apohana. According to the Buddhists, none of these three interpretations are tenable. If Apoha means the positive assertion of an object as conceptually determined, then it really means an object which put forward the term Apoha meaningless. By the term Apoha, the Buddhist logicians understand a positive entity that is qualified by discrimination. Apoha vishishto vidhi. Anyone may point out that when we utter a word like cow, its qualifier is not pronounced in ordinary verbal usage. So, how can we understand the true sense of the word cow to be one which is discriminated from the non-cows? Onnapoho Bishishto Go. Here, Mokshakara Gupta, who is a later Buddhist logician, presented an analogical example of linguistic usage following Ratnakirti. According to him, when we utter the word blue lotus, the qualifier or adjective blue of the lotus is explicit. But when we say the word Indivara, which is actually a synonym of blue lotus, then we can grasp the blueness of lotus, though it is not mentioned separately. Likewise, when you use the word cow, not only the sense of the positive entity cow is manifested, but simultaneously we have the understanding of its discrimination from dissimilar things by prosodjo type of negation. So, by the power of any word, that is any sanketo, the exact connotation can be manifested without explicitly mentioning the qualifier. Criticism of this notion of Apoha. The Naiyayikas and the Mimamsakas hold that this way of substituting the notion of universal with that of Apoha cannot be accepted, since it involves the fallacy of circularity. The point is that when we define a cow in terms of exclusion from non-cow, the question arises, is the exclusion of non-cow a nature of the external or its attribute? if the exclusion of non-cow is its nature, then the non-cow cannot be understood without the prior establishment of the cow. For the non-cow being of the nature of negation of the cow requires the knowledge of the cow. In this way, to accept the Buddhist view involves moving around in a circle. That is, in order to have the knowledge of the non-cow, you need to have knowledge of the cow. And in order to know the cow, you are to have the knowledge of the non-cow. So in this way, we will be moving round in a circle. If, on the other hand, the exclusion of non-cow is considered to be an attribute of the external unreal, the question arises, why cannot the Buddhists accept a real universal cowness as an attribute of a positive nature and do away with a negative universal? That is, the Buddhists could not totally do away with the general terms. And in order to in order to account for the meaning of the general terms, they have brought in the notion of Apoha, which is something negative. So the Nyayo school points out that if you accept something, then why don't you accept why don't you accept something positive, which is much easier to grasp than what you are saying? So your view of the Apoho cannot be accepted. Thus, in concluding the entire discussion, or in winding up the entire discussion, we can say that the Buddhist way of explaining the meaning of general terms with the help of exclusion of counter correlates without admitting any corresponding external real has drawn the criticisms of opponent schools, especially from the Nyayo and Mimamsa. Nyayo philosophers, starting from Vatsyayana till Udayana, have tried to show through their own arguments the futility of the Buddhist analysis. And in face of such criticisms, the Buddhists have revised their concepts in such a way that the earlier objections become worthless. In this way, through the attacks and counterattacks, both the Nyayo and the Buddhists could make significant contributions in the advancement of their own logical thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Madhumita Di. Thank you very much. I'm having a little bit of issue with the internet. Thank you very much. And now I would request the participants to ask ma'am any question that they may have.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Ma'am, where you ended your lecture, like the two Naya criticism against the Buddhist notion of Apoho, ma'am, my question is, have the Buddhists said anything against those in particular two Naya criticisms?
Yes, of course, they have said. And you can, if you go through the text of Gyanosri Mitra, and his disciple Ratnakirti, you will be able to find to find the arguments of the Buddhists. Okay,
Okay,
so
okay.
for example, the Buddhists will point out that this argument of circularity.
ভীষণ
Hello,
ভারী উড়ে যাচ্ছে ছুড়ে যাচ্ছে
hello.
Yes, ma'am. Yes. Yes, ma'am. I'm listening to you.
Okay, just a minute. Mm. The Buddhists have always said if you go through this the text of Dharmakirti and later on of Gyanosri Mitra and Ratnakirti, you will find answer to those objections of the Nyaya and the Mimamsa, like that of circularity or unknowability, etc.
Okay, okay. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much, ma'am. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Any other questions?
May I leave now? I have some
You may
meeting now.
ask in Bangla too. There is no problem.
Yes, yes.
Okay. In case you have any questions, you may also write to ma'am through Indadul. Thank you, Madhumita Di, for taking time out from your busy schedule and being with us and delivering such a detailed exposition of the Buddhist view. I express my gratitude on behalf of the Bhakti Vedanta Research Institute as well as my own behalf. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Madhuchanda, for giving me this opportunity to share my views with others. I have some 5 minutes left. I don't know whether the students or the participants could understand all the points.
I'm sure they did. I'm sure they did.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.